Hello and welcome. Continuing our discussion of survey methodology for a particular research project, we're going to talk a bit about biases in surveys and how that affects the inferences that we can make based on our survey data. In the previous lecture on survey sampling, we discussed the problem of sampling bias, which is a particular type of bias that we might want to be aware of that comes from taking a non-random sample from the population. In addition to that sampling bias, there are two other main types of biases that we should pay attention to because they could lead us to draw the wrong conclusions from the sample that we've surveyed. The first of these types is non-response bias, and the second is response bias. So let's go through each of these in turn. So if you're doing a survey, one of the things that you have to consider is your sampling strategy, how you're going to ask people to respond to your survey questions. But that's not the end of the story because you can't force people to participate in your survey. So non-response bias happens when the people who decline to participate in your survey are systematically different from people who do participate in the survey. So because some of the people in your sample are not going to participate in your study, or they might fail to answer particular questions in your study, this can bias your sample if the people who don't participate are systematically different from the people who do participate. So let's consider a couple of examples to illuminate this a little bit more. One way that you might administer a survey is to send out a questionnaire by mail to everybody in your sample. But we know that people in the middle class are the people who are most likely to respond to that questionnaire, to send it back to you, and people in lower classes and upper classes are less likely to respond to that questionnaire. So that means that the responses that you get back from this questionnaire are likely to overrepresent people in the middle class and to underrepresent people in lower and upper classes. This is particularly a problem if the research question that you're trying to answer is affected in any way by the socioeconomic status of people who are responding. If you're only getting responses from the middle class, you run the risk of having a biased survey. Another way that you might administer a survey would be to call people on their home telephones. If this is your strategy for getting responses to your survey, something to be attentive to is that people who are at home when you call them might have different characteristics from people who are not home when you call them. So depending on the time of day that you call, you might be sampling very different groups of people. So probably people who are unemployed are more likely to be home. People who don't have a job willingly, who are stay-at-home parents, for example, are more likely to be at home when you call. Depending on the time of day that you call, you might be more likely to get people who have particular types of jobs. So if you're calling in the evening, you're likely to be oversampling people with regular day shift jobs and undersampling people with evening and night shift jobs. So those are things that you have to keep in mind if that is your particular survey strategy. Another thing to keep in mind is that people who are enthusiastic about a survey top are more likely to complete the survey. So for example, if you send out a questionnaire that's about a particular hot button political issue, people who have really strong opinions about that issue are going to be more likely to fill out the survey and send it back to you because they have a pre-existing interest and they probably want their voice to be heard. Whereas people who are more apathetic or neutral on the issue are more likely to toss that questionnaire in the trash, and so you won't have their views represented in your sample. So even if we've taken a good random sample from the population, we can still run into non-response bias. So unlike sampling bias, which only occurs when we've taken a non-random, non-probability sample from the population, non-response bias can occur even if we have a great random sampling strategy. And it just happens when some of our subjects fail to participate in the study. So here's a question. If non-response is random, so if all of the subjects in our sample have an equal probability of not participating in the study, are our inferences still going to be biased? Are we going to run into non-response bias problems? The answer to that question is no. Non-response is only a problem for us when it is systematic, when there is some unifying characteristic of the non-responders that is going to bias our results because we're not capturing the particular relevant attitudes of that group of non-responders. If non-response is random, then there isn't any particular unifying characteristic of the people who aren't responding to the survey, and so we aren't going to end up with a biased result. So let's consider this example. Let's say that students at an elementary school are given a questionnaire to take home, and they're supposed to bring it back after their parents have filled it out. One of the questions on that questionnaire asks the parent whether they find that their work schedule makes it difficult for them to spend time with their kids after school. Of the parents who replied in the questionnaires that are sent back, 85% of the parents said no. So based on these results, the school concludes that the vast majority of parents have no difficulty with spending time with their kids after school. This is not a good conclusion for the school officials to come to. Why are these strong conclusions not warranted? Take a minute and think about it. As you probably guessed, the issue here is non-response bias. Parents who didn't respond to this questionnaire are probably parents who have a particular characteristic that makes them less likely to respond. In this case, the parents who returned the survey are probably ones who don't have an issue finding time to spend with their kids after school. So parents who are more likely to have free time in the evenings are also more likely to be the parents who have time to fill out this questionnaire and send it back with their kid. Whereas more busy parents are probably also the parents who don't have time to fill out this questionnaire. So the surveys that get sent back are more likely to be over-representative of the parents who do have time to spend with their kids after school, and the parents who didn't send the survey back are going to be more likely to be the parents who didn't have that time, so they're going to be underrepresented in this sample. So the school officials should not conclude that the majority of the parents of the kids in their school have this time to spend with their kids after school because of non-response bias. The other main type of bias that we're going to talk about in this lecture is response bias. And this is a type of bias that happens when the survey or a particular question in the survey isn't a good measure of the actual attitude or response of the subject being surveyed. So let's talk about several examples of this. A really basic problem that might cause response bias is if a question on the survey is confusing or poorly worded to the point where the respondent to the survey doesn't know which way to answer in order to represent his or her views, or they answer a particular way that isn't actually representative of their views. They answered incorrectly because they didn't understand the question. A framing effect occurs when the way that a question is phrased affects the response of the people answering the question. So let's say that you're offering a respondent a choice between two options in your survey, and one of those options is phrased as a really positive thing and the other is phrased as a really negative thing. The respondent is going to be more likely to gravitate toward the more positively phrased response, whereas if the options were presented more neutrally, they might have chosen differently. That would be an example of a framing effect, which can lead to response bias. Another possible source of response bias is a priming effect. So let's consider an example here to talk about this. Let's say that you want to ask a survey question about how the respondent feels about policies that are tough on crime. But let's say that earlier in the survey, you asked a question that brought up some really dismal statistics about crime in their city and primed them to be worried about the prevalence of crime and their likelihood of being victimized. And then you ask them a question about how much they want there to be tough on crime policies in their city. If they're primed to be worried about crime, then they're also more likely to support policies that are tough on crime. Whereas if you present them with statistics earlier in the survey that talk about the growth of the prison population and the increase in the length of sentences overall and the effects of tough on crime policies on all sorts of statistics about prison populations, and then ask them a question about whether they want those policies to continue, the subject might be more likely to not support really tough criminal justice policies. So those are examples of priming effects that are going to influence the responses of the people taking this survey. An anchoring effect happens when people latch on to a particular piece of information that they've been provided, and that influences how they then respond to a question. So let's say that you want to know what people are willing to pay for their next house. So you ask them hypothetically to think of the next house that they think that they will buy and what they would be willing to pay for that. You're going to get slightly different answers, most likely, according to the anchoring effect, if you give people information about home prices. So let's say that you provide people with the information that the average price that people pay for a house in the United States is around $350,000. The anchoring effect means that people are more likely to make their judgments about how much they would be willing to pay for their next house relative to that information that you've given them. So they'll think, okay, so the average price that a person pays for a house in the United States is $350,000. I probably don't want to spend as much as the average person, so maybe I would spend $300,000 on my next house. The anchoring effect is going to affect people differently if the piece of information that you give them is different. So if you tell people that the median price of a house in the United States is around $200,000, so lower than the average price, then the answer that people give to this particular question is going to be anchored around that piece of information. So in that case, your respondent thinking, okay, so the average or the sort of the normal price that a person would pay for a house is around $200,000. Maybe I don't want to spend quite as much as your normal person, so I would pay $180,000 for my house. That same person might give you a very different response to the same question depending on the information that you give them about a normal price of a house in the United States, and that's an anchoring effect. The Hawthorne effect comes from research that says that people are more likely to change or modify their behavior in some way if they're aware that they're being observed, if they know that someone's going to be paying attention to the way that they act or respond to a question or something like that. So a Hawthorne effect can work in a number of different ways depending on what you're getting people to respond to. But it is a well-known effect that can bias people's responses. For example, people might be moved to say that they would be more altruistic, or say that they would act in a way that they perceive to be more compassionate or something like that if they know that they are being observed. Social desirability bias occurs when a respondent is concerned about answering in a way that's going to be viewed favorably by somebody else. So if there is a socially desirable answer, then the social desirability bias effect is going to push respondents toward answering in that socially desirable way. So let's say that you're asking people how many books they read per year. If people think that reading more books is more socially desirable, they will probably over-report how many books that they read. So that answer to that question is likely to be biased because people are going to tend to tell you that they've read more books than they actually have. So that's just one example of this social bias. Related to these effects of social sensitivity or social desirability is something called the Bradley effect. The Bradley effect is a phenomenon where non-white political candidates do better in the polls than they do in the actual election. So people are more likely to say that they'll vote for a non-white candidate than they are to actually go and vote for that candidate. So this is perhaps driven by people wanting to make sure that they don't seem racist by saying that they would vote for the minority candidate rather than the white candidate. But then in actuality, they do support the white candidate and they're going to go to the voting booth and cast their vote for that candidate instead. And finally, response bias can also be caused by interviewer effects. This is where the characteristics of the interviewer bias the responses of the people taking the survey. So if faced with an interviewer who is a woman, people are more likely to respond in ways that are viewed as more woman-friendly, perhaps to say that they are a feminist or indicate support for an equal rights amendment or something like that. That's an example of an interviewer effect, where a person responds differently than they otherwise would have because of the way that the interviewer is. To illustrate how response bias can play out in real life, let's look at this 2006 New York Times poll that asked these questions to different groups of survey subjects. So one group of survey respondents were asked, do you favor a gasoline tax? And 12% of them said that they did. Other subjects were asked instead, do you favor a gasoline tax to reduce U.S. dependence on foreign oil? And in response to this question, despite it being asking about the same thing, the gasoline tax, 55% said yes to this question. So what kind of response bias is this an example of? This is an example of a framing effect. So the way that the question is phrased has an impact on the way that people respond to it. In the second version of this question that says, do you favor a gasoline tax to reduce U.S. dependence on foreign oil, a positive benefit of the gasoline tax is presented to survey respondents. And so more of those people were likely to say that they did favor the gasoline tax than when the question was just phrased very plainly, do you favor a gasoline tax? So the difference in phrasing of these questions affects the way that people respond to it. So we're doing these studies to try to estimate a population parameter that we're interested in. Our estimate is going to be equal to the true population parameter plus or minus any bias that exists in our research design, plus or minus the sampling error that we have. So remember when we looked at the sampling distribution of sample statistics, we noted that depending on the particular sample that we got, our estimate is going to be lower than or higher than the true population parameter. That's random variance that we can't do away with. There's always going to be some difference between our sample and the actual population, as long as we're not taking the whole population and studying it. So that sampling error is always going to remain, though if we take large enough samples, that sampling error is likely to be smaller. And then the bias that affects our estimate really depends on our research design. So if we are careful to take a random sample, we're going to reduce the bias in our estimate of the population parameter. And if we're careful about the way that we do our survey to avoid things like non-response bias and response bias, we're going to be able to move that bias parameter in this equation towards 0, which is what we want. We would like for our estimate to be an unbiased estimate of the population parameter. And that wraps up our discussion of survey biases. Thank you for tuning in, and I will see you next time.